Hey, it's Patrick from JP Cycles, and we are going to do some hot rod stuff to this Sportster. We're gonna go ahead and put a big bore kit on our Sportster here, and this is a 2001 Evo Sportster. It is an 883. For most of you Evo Sportster guys out there, this is gonna be a very similar install. Now, a good time to do a bunch of stuff is right now. So most of you guys, if you're gonna do a big bore kit, I would recommend you do cams at the same time. Obviously, we're gonna have to address jetting. We're gonna break this down a little bit though, and I'll put some links in as we do the work to our bike. We're gonna do this video as just the big bore. So we're going to take this from an 883 to a 1200. There are 1250 kits out there. The installation is the same. The difference being that this 883 head works with the 1200 pistons. If we had, let's say, a box stock 1200, we wanted to make it a little more hot rod, we could go to a 1250, but the installation will be the same. And with cams, we'll put that in another video. So as we do this, we're going to do this install of the big bore, and we're gonna do it reusing the stock push rods and readjusting everything from the top. Whereas if we were just doing the cams, and in the cam video, we'll use some adjustable ones. And then you're also gonna have to address carb jetting, which we'll get to, and we'll put in another video and put it into the description. So we'll kind of do this in bite-sized pieces, and you can follow along with the evolution of our Sportster here. Now the first thing we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to take the seat off, we're gonna disconnect the battery, remove our gas tank, our intake, and our pipes. And as you can see, this is not a bone stock motorcycle, and everybody out there, if you're to this point in modifying your bike, yours probably isn't stock either, so yours will be a little bit different. Basically, everybody needs to do the same thing. Take the seat off, disconnect the battery, take the oil out, take the intake off, take the pipes off. If you need a link to a oil change video to Evo Sportster, I'll drop that in there as well. Hopefully, if you're taking on this job, you are familiar with changing the oil on your motorcycle. But if not, we're here to help. So let's get to work. So the next thing we're gonna do is pull our carb off and our top motor mounts. The carb is just the spigot style carb, pulls right off, but you have to take your throttle cables off, and then any VOS or plugs you might have plugged in, unplug those, and the carb will just work its way out. Now, there is still gas in the carb, so be careful how you turn it and you don't dump gas on yourself. The motor mounts, the front one, 9/16, and then the very top one is a 5/16 Allen. Those are pretty snug. May have to put some elbow grease behind it. Also, if you have a coil or ignition that's side mounted, you have to pull those out of the way. That'd probably vary depending on your bike. Once we have the motor mounts and the ignition, everything cleared out of the way, the next thing we have to take off is the manifold. You're gonna need a 1/4-inch Allen, probably a ball Allen. And the back of this manifold, or the left side, the clutch side of the manifold actually has slots in it. So you just have to loosen these two Allens up, then pull the brake side Allens out, and that manifold will slide out on the brake side of the bike. So for the brake side or front side of this manifold, it can be kind of an angle to get these in there. You really can't get your short side in there, so you either need an Allen with a short key side on it, or you can always do the old wrench trick with the ball Allen and break them loose that way. Okay, so now we're gonna take the rocker tops off. You're gonna need a 3/16 Allen, and there's 4 Allens in each one, and we're gonna take the top off, and then there's gonna be some gaskets in there that are gonna come out with it. It's gonna be pretty simple with the exception of the one that's on the clutch side in the very back corner here. You'll probably need a ball Allen or need to saw one off or something to get in there, or if you're really fancy and you have a rocker box wrench, that'll get that one off there for you. But we'll take all those out, and we'll get our tricky one out here, and then we'll be able to actually remove the rocker assemblies. So this is actually 2 pieces. It's just kind of stuck together. There's a gasket in between there. You need to split these because we're going to replace all these gaskets when we put it back together. But this is what we're trying to get down to here, this rocker assembly. This back one can be tricky because it's so close to the backbone of the frame. You gotta kind of lift up on it and then twist it out that way. So the next thing we have to do is take off our rocker assemblies. But as we work on each head, we need to make sure the valves are closed. Take the pressure off, we take off the rocker assembly. So we're going to jack this bike up, put it in high gear, and rotate the motor until we can see the valves are closed. And what that means is that these rockers, the little fingers on both valves, will be up. If they're down, they're pushing the valve open. We want them up. And then once they're up, we're going to take these 2 bolts on the brake side of the bike off first, and then the 2 bolts over here on the clutch side of the bike. So we're going to take a 1/2 inch and take these 2 bolts out. Take our 1/2 inch and take these 2 bolts out. Then there's some 3/16 Allens over here on the ears. We'll take those out. And then these 2 7/16 bolts in here will be the last ones. And this will lift off here. And it's very important to keep the front with the front and the rear with the rear as it goes with valve train components. So make sure you mark this or mark somewhere where you set this. Keep all of your front components together and all of your rear components together when you go to put them back together. So to get this back rocker off, it's helpful to take the push rods out because there's not enough room to lift them up over the top. So if you just flip it forward a little bit, you should be able to get in there and slide the push rod up and through the rocker base. And don't worry about getting them mixed up. I try to keep front and rears together, but the markings on the push rod will tell you where they go back as far as intake and exhaust. So I just try to keep front and rear together. So if you have any push rods left in the tubes, go ahead and pull those out. And then we're gonna start to take off the cylinder head. So you're gonna need a 12-point half-inch to do it. There's a sequence to loosen them up. And you follow the sequence an eighth of a turn at a time. So we're gonna break it loose, go to the next one, break it loose, break it loose, break it loose, and then eighth of a turn at a time so that head comes off or loosens up nice and gradual and doesn't get, you know, racked out of shape when you're loosening it up. So the sequence is going to be on the front head, the front clutch side bolt is number 1, the rear clutch side bolt is number 2, the front brake side is 3, and the rear brake side is 4 for the front head. For the rear head, the rear clutch side is 1, the front clutch side is 2, the rear brake side is 3, and the front brake side is 4. We'll go in those orders. So these push rod tubes are just kind of sandwiched in here. So we're just gonna bump this head up to get it loose and pull it off here. These might stay here, they might come with your head, just know you might need to grab a hold of them. After we get this one off, we'll go ahead and repeat the same process on the back here. So now we're gonna bump our cylinders loose and slide them off. And remember, they're on the Pistons or rings, which is a pretty tight little fit there. So you're gonna have to slide them off. And generally speaking, if you were reusing those pistons or something like that, you wanna keep them from banging into these cylinder studs. We're gonna replace ours, but it's still a good idea to kind of be nice and easy with those. And then if you were gonna leave this open for any amount of time, you wanna cover your case here so nothing falls down in there. And I've seen guys like stuff rags or something in there and forget about them. Just be very careful however you cover this. The easiest way is to probably take some sort of like shop towel, put a little split in it, and put it over the top of the rod if you were gonna leave it for a while. We're gonna bang these loose and then slide our cylinders up off there. That's not great. So I'm covering these spigots where the cylinders go, because the next thing we're gonna need to do is take off our pistons. And to do that, we need to take off these little circlips in here, and you don't wanna drop them down in the bottom of your motor, because that could be semi-catastrophic. So I'm gonna cover up these holes with some paper towels, and then we're gonna get in here with a pick, and we're going to pick one of the circlips out, and then we'll push the wrist pin out so we can take our pistons off. So now we're gonna push from the other side of the clip that we didn't take out. And if you can't push it out with your finger, you can take a socket or something and push on that. What you don't wanna do is hit this with something and side load those rods. So just be patient and push on that with like a socket or something, and it'll come right out, which we're gonna have to do, I think. Okay, the next thing we need to do is a little bit of prep work. We need to do it on the cases and probably on the cylinders. On the cases, we need to clean these up so there's no more gunk on there, and make sure they're nice and shiny for the new gasket surface. Don't use anything that's like ultra abrasive, or if you have to use like a gasket scraper, make sure you don't dig into the aluminum at all. A little bit of elbow grease go a long way here, and don't drop anything down inside the case. Now on the cylinders, depending if you had your cylinders bored out like we did, or if you have a brand new set of cylinders, this may be a little bit different. A brand new set of cylinders, the gasket surfaces should be really nice. Ours, we needed to prep a little bit and clean up, and then on the insides of the bores on both a new cylinder and a bored out cylinder, you need to clean those out really, really well. Use a light colored cloth and basically keep wiping those down until there's no residue left on the cloth. And the other thing we need to do is make sure you get any dowels or anything that were in the cylinder put back in the cylinder before we put those on. Okay, so now we have to set our ring gaps. This is pretty important. You wanna make sure you get this right. You're gonna need a set of feeler gauges and possibly a file. Now, there's no really one size fits all for a ring gap. You need to follow the instructions that come with your kit or with your pistons. For us, these set of Wiseco's right here, they have the chart. And you're probably, or you maybe you might get some options here. Like for us, it says, you know, a street moderate motor with turbo or nitrous, or you have a street strip application. That's gonna determine which way the ring gap goes. Now on ours, we need to take the bore size, which is 3.49 on our bike here, and multiply it by the number they give us here, and that'll determine the gap we want. And the gap I'm talking about is on your piston ring, is this gap here. And when you put it into the cylinder, it's really gonna tighten it up a lot. And that's the gap we're gonna measure. So when we do this, normally your top two rings will have different measurements. The bottom one's gonna be a little bit bigger than the top one. Your oilers just shouldn't have to gap at all. So we're gonna put this in here. I'm gonna show you how to measure it. Now, if you have to take some off, you can't put back, so you don't wanna take too much off. If you have to do this, there are some fancy ring filing tools out there that are like electric. They're about $300. You can do this with a file. A couple things to remember. When you're filing the ring, to file this gap down to make it bigger, you want to do a little bit at a time and keep measuring. The other thing is, you don't want this to be angled. You don't want to tip this one way like this, or make it weird. It's got to be straight and only file on one side. Now, one way to make that straight is to take your file and put it in a vise. I would protect the file teeth that's in the vise. Once it's in the vise, then you can drag the ring back and forth across it, and that will keep it pretty straight. Once you've came to the gap that you want, make sure there's no burrs left on there. Take a little bit of fine grit sandpaper, maybe even your file, and knock those burrs off. But for now, let's check these. I'll show you how to check them. We're gonna put them in the cylinder, and then we're gonna take the piston, flip it upside down, and just push it down in there a little bit. And the reason we're doing that is because we don't want the ring in there crooked. That'll help us get the ring in there nice and straight. Once it's down in there, then we'll take our feeler gauge with the desired measurement we want, and we'll slide it in there. We'll slide it in there, make sure if it's too tight, we're gonna file some off. If it's good, it's good. Some companies, I've done both. Some of them always have to file them. Every once in a while you get some that are pretty much right on the money. So let's go ahead and measure these. I'm gonna do my top ring first. Squeeze it together, slide it down in there. Once we get it fairly even and started in there, we'll take the piston. Just gonna slide it down a ways so I can still reach it with my feeler gauge. And for my ring on this top ring, I'm looking for 17 thousandths. So I have my 17 thousandths gauge. It's about perfect. It's dragging a little bit, which I like. I definitely wouldn't want it any more than that. So I'm actually not gonna file this one. So for the second ring, we're looking for a little bit different measurement, 19 thousandths, so it's the same procedure. That ring is also good. We're gonna repeat the process on our other cylinder and our other set of rings. That's a winner. Should I say second ring, the expansion ring? You're at 19 thou. Perfect. Okay, so now that all of our ring gaps are how we want them, we're gonna put the rings on the pistons. And I'm gonna go over how those ring gaps need to be orientated on the piston, but really, you're gonna have to do your final check of that before you slide the cylinder onto it. It's just easier to show it here. So we're gonna put the piston rings on. I'm gonna show you the direction they need to be, but on the bike, you're gonna have to double check that because it's likely from here to the bike, those things are gonna shift around a little bit. We're also going to put one of the circlips in. That way, when we get over to the bike, we have one in, we'll put the wrist pin in and then put the second circlip in to hold the piston in. But we're gonna do one of them here on the bench right now. So they make all kinds of fancy tools for these, and you can do that, but a little bit of elbow grease and thumb can also get that done. Her little snap there, you want to make sure that that clip is seated in that groove in there, because that clip coming out in the motor is bad juju. And most pistons will have the forward part, no matter if it's front or rear, that part needs to go to the front of the engine. The reason that's important here is so we can put on our rings in the proper order. Now, if you have if you have the piston ring pliers, that's great. Not necessarily a necessity though. We're gonna work from the bottom up. This big groove on the bottom is where the oils go, the oil rings and the oil keepers. So we're gonna put one of the oil rails on, and then we're gonna put the oil expander ring on, and then we're gonna put the top oil rail on, just like that, and they're all gonna go in this groove right there. The first one we put on is gonna be the bottom one, and you want the gap over here like this. Then for the expander ring, you want the gap over here, and then for the top rail, you want the gap over here like this. Your pistons more than likely will have a nice diagram with them of how they want those. That's pretty common, and again, you'll need to check these locations of the gaps when you get it on the bike. This is the fun part, finding that gap. So those two are good. That's the bottom oil rail gap right there. This is the top oil rail gap right there. So this oil ring expander, that's the gap right there. Right there, you can barely see the split. And it needs to come straight over here. But you don't want to move your other rings, which I did. This one moved. So I'm going to move it back while I hold that expander. And again, you need to check these when they're on the bike. Right now we're looking pretty good. So for this second ring right here, we're calling it second because it's second from the top. These two rings may or may not have markings on them, this one and the top one. If it has a mark on it, like a dot or a letter or something, that needs to go up. What that's going to do, it's going to put, there's actually a bevel on this ring here, and that's going to put that bevel down. And in our case here, this gap of this ring, the second ring, needs to go towards the front. Okay, so our top ring actually doesn't have a mark on it, so it doesn't matter which side goes up. And that gap needs to go to the back of the piston. So what I like to do is put some assembly lube on the wrist pin and in the piston itself. That way we slide this in, it'll be nice and lubricated. So we'll put some assembly lube on this. We'll take it over to the bike. We'll slide the wrist pin in, making sure it's all the way in. And then we can put the last circlip in there. Same thing, you want to make sure it snaps up in that groove really good. So we talked about this before with our ring gaps. When you put the piston on, you want to make sure the forward arrow is facing the front of the motorcycle. If you pre-start the wrist pin and make sure it's not poking through here in the gap, it'll make it a little easier to put on there. And again, make sure you've lubed all your holes. Okay, the pistons are on the rods. Don't forget to put your base gaskets on. So we're gonna go ahead and drop our base gaskets down on here now. And then what we wanna do is we wanna oil the inside of our cylinders before we put them on. So I'm just gonna take some motor oil, put a nice coating on the inside of the cylinder. Then we're gonna bring it over here, and you want whatever piston you're working with all the way up. It's gonna make it easier to put on, and you're gonna need a piston ring compressor. So before we slide the cylinder down here, go back, check your ring gaps. Make sure they're where they're supposed to be. This is the last chance you're gonna get to do that. We're gonna check the ring gaps. Then at this point, you really need a ring compressor tool of some sort. Pretty cheap and it's handy to have around. You could try to slide this cylinder on, do the old fingernail method. I don't recommend that. Something like a piston ring compressor like this band goes around there. It's gonna keep those nice and compressed and in place while we work that cylinder down on there. Something that's not a bad idea to do to keep this cylinder from moving up and down while you're pressing down on the other one is to take a socket and one of the shorter head bolts. Just use the socket as a spacer and run this down on there, and this will keep that cylinder in place from trying to shift up and down while you're messing with the other piston and cylinder. Here we go again. So the next thing we're gonna do is prep to put our heads and pushrod tubes in. Before we do that, I'm gonna pull our tappet blocks out here and replace these gaskets. Then we'll prep the head, put the head gaskets and pushrod tubes on. Go get them over there. So we're going to replace our gaskets and our tappet blocks, and they have a little shoulder on them. And when you put the new one in, the narrower part goes up into it. You can see it's kind of machined out to fit in there, and then just slide the push rod through. Okay, so now I'm going to put the front two push rod tubes on, and I'm going to put the Allen back in there. This is a 1/4 inch Allen. We're gonna run it in there, but we're not gonna torque it yet. We'll come back after we get the head on. I just wanna get these in there, so when we put the head on, they'll be in there. We don't have to fight them later. Okay, now we're going to the bench. We're going to prep our heads and get ready to put them on the bike. So So we want to make sure that most of the gasket material, the head gasket material, is cleaned off of the surface of the head. Same thing with the rocker box gasket material. Make sure it's pretty well cleaned off there because you want good seal on your other gaskets. Up here where the pushrod tubes go, make sure you take out your old O-rings. You don't want to double those up, you'll have a problem. And then we're going to go ahead and just push the new O-rings into the head right now. Another thing I like to do while I have the head off the bike is put the exhaust gasket in. It's just easier to put in while the head is off the bike. So we're gonna go over the bike, we're gonna drop our head gasket in place, and we're gonna put new O-rings on our locating dowels. Like this. So we're gonna put the head on, and we have our head bolts. Make sure there's no grit or grime left down in there. And you wanna put just a touch of oil in these. Then we'll set the head on, and we'll drop the head bolts in and just start them finger tight. It's hard for me to see from this side. Up in there. When you're setting the head on here, you can look down in here and make sure that your pushrod tubes are seated into your O-rings. Get a good look at them right there. So before we torque all this, I'm gonna do everything that I just did to the front head, to the rear head, then we'll come back and talk about how to torque all this. Okay, there's a couple different ways to torque these heads. I'm gonna show you the way the book shows to do it, and some of the gasket manufacturers may have a different way of doing it. But the way we're gonna do it is you follow the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 being on the front head, 1 being the left side rear bolt, and then the one in front of that on the left side is 2. 3 is back here by your intake, and then 4 is up here. So that's the sequence we're gonna follow. Then we're gonna go 10 to 12 foot-pounds. Then we're gonna come back, and we're gonna go 15 to 17 foot-pounds, and then we're gonna mark each screw, or each head bolt, and then we're gonna turn it 90 degrees. And then we're gonna loosen it up, go back and break them all loose, and then do the exact same sequence again. 10 to 12, 15 to 17, and then 90 degrees. We'll follow this, we'll do the same thing on the rear head, only the sequence is going to be different, but we'll do that one in just a second. 90. 1, 2, 3, okay. So now we're going to loosen them all up and then tighten them all back with the same sequence. So now we're gonna do the rear head, the exact same sequence we just did on the front head, only the order is different. So it's gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4. But same thing, same torque specs, same 90-degree, loosen it up, and then do it all again. Okay. All. Yeah, that kind of sucked. So now we're going to go ahead and drop our push rods in, and they're color coded. The pink is for the exhaust side, and the brown is for the intake side on both cylinders. It's important that you get these in the right spot because the exhaust push rod is actually just a tiny bit longer than the intake one. So for now, we're just going to drop them down into the push rod tubes. Right? So now we can't forget to go back and torque our Pushrod 2 bolts here to 15 foot-pounds. And then we're gonna get our rocker boxes ready to be put on. And we want to have as little pressure as possible when putting these on. So we're going to put the bike in high gear. I'm gonna rotate the rear wheel until these 2 push rods, basically the pistons at top dead center, and these 2 push rods will be at their lowest point. I currently have them there now, but I'll torque these and then I'll rotate this over so you can watch these go up and down, and you'll see them when they both are down. That's where you want to stop, and then we'll get the rocker box ready to put on. So this will be where I'm going to stop it, right there. So the first thing we need to do is put our gasket on. Can't forget to do that. We'll drop that right on there. Now the next thing I like to do is put these 4 big bolts in here to get the gasket lined up and get them started. But if for some reason you took your rockers apart, when you put the shaft back in, you want to make sure that this little divot, this little cutout is lined up on the push rod side here. You want to make sure it's lined up because it has to be sitting so this bolt can clear. So like right now I have this shaft out of here. If I try to put this bolt in there, it gets hung up. So when we push it back in there, that cutout will be lined up so that bolt drops through there. And then the other thing is when you put this on the head, you want to make sure these rockers are kind of flattened out like that. Otherwise, they're going to get hung up. So you want to kind of make sure they're flattened out when you put this in there. And then you want to make sure that the push rods land up in the little pockets on the actual rocker arms. And the bolts will help you line up your gasket. So our gasket's lined up, I got the bolt started, and the push rods are in the little pockets here. So I'm going to start our other rocker box bolts in here, these 3 hex heads and these 2 Allens. I'm going to start them in there, but I'm just going to kind of leave them finger tight. And what I'm going to do with the 4 1/2-inch bolts here is I'm going to work in a crisscross pattern while this pushes down, because this is going to start having pressure. It's going to start collapsing the lifters and getting pressure from the valve spring. So you want to take this down at the same time. So I'm going to start working these down, and as these push the rocker box and the rocker arms down, you can kind of tighten these smaller ones down too. But we're really working with these. We want the pressure to be handled by these 4. And once we get them bottomed out, we're going to torque these from 15 to 18 foot-pounds. One more important note, as we get these tightened down and then torqued, you don't want to turn this engine over right now. You don't want to turn it over at the wheel. You don't want to move to this cylinder yet until you can spin these push rods with your fingers. Once this is all tightened down and torqued, you need to be able to spin these with your fingers. That means these lifters are bled down enough. If you turn this over while these are still tight, you can cause some problems. You could maybe touch a valve in there or something. So make sure you can spin these before you move to this cylinder. But I'll work these down. We'll torque these to 15 to 18. Then I'll come back and give you the torque specs for the smaller ones before we check on our push rods. So now that we have our 4 main bolts torqued, we have our other bolts ran down. The 3/16 Allens on these little ears of the rocker, we're gonna torque them anywhere from 90 to 120 inch-pounds. And then the 3/7/16 bolts here on the inside of the rocker is gonna be torqued from 10 to 13 foot-pounds. Okay, we have our push rod spinning free, so we know we're good on this head. Now I like to do the other rocker box assembly without buttoning this up so I can see everything. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna roll the rear wheel over so I can get both of my push rods down, meaning I have the most pressure off them when I put this together. And we're gonna repeat the same process we did up here. Put our gasket on, same sequence, same torque spec, and we'll get our back rocker set up on here. So there's a lot less room back here. So this one's gonna be a little bit tougher. Don't get too discouraged. Just keep working at it and I promise it'll go in there. So now we're ready to start reassembling the rest of our rocker boxes, but we need to do a couple of things with gaskets. Make sure you pull all the old rubber gaskets out, and then there are these little umbrella valves here. It's a good thing to replace them. They just pull out, you pull the new one in. On the top of the boxes, make sure you replace the little fiber gaskets that are under the little Allen screws. A lot of times they get stuck down in there or they get stuck on the screw. Make sure those don't get doubled up. Make sure you get them all off there and get the new ones on before you assemble it. Okay, so now we're gonna put our rocker boxes all the way together. We're gonna put in new gaskets. Don't forget this little square gasket that goes here in the middle, and then put the new fiber gaskets on the 4 Allens on the top. We're gonna torque those anywhere from 10 to 13 foot-pounds. Okay. One like that right there. Push rods are spinning nice and free, so we'll go ahead and do the same procedure on the rear rocker box we did on the front and button this up. There it is. Oh shit. So the next thing we're gonna do is put our intake manifold on. But before I do that, right now is a great time to replace the seals. The last thing you want is an intake leak after you get your new hot rod back together. So this is a really simple thing to do. We're gonna replace all three. You have the manifold seals that go up against the heads, and then you have the seal that or the spigot seal where your carburetor slides into. So we'll show you how to put those on, and then we're going to put the manifold into the head. So these just slip on and off. They might be kind of tight coming off, but the only thing to remember is that this little tapered or chamfered part of the seal that goes down into the clamp area. And you can see in there it's actually beveled to take that seal just that way. So as long as you get it in there that way, you're in good shape. This little spigot seal, I like to put just a little bit of grease or something on here to make sure it slides on real nice. And the other thing is when you go to push the carb on, it doesn't hurt to put just like a little thin layer of oil or grease or something on there when that carb pushes on, just to prevent it from tearing or something. So you need to have the left side or the bottom manifold screws started in there, loosely started, because then we're going to take this manifold and push it in there like that. It's got these two little grooves. Those are going to drop around those screws. Once you get those in there, then you can start the ones at the top and tighten them up kind of at the same time, back and forth, you know, all the way around so it sucks down even. And these do have a torque spec. It's 6 to 10 foot-pounds, but it's going to be real difficult to get a torque wrench in there. So just use your best judgment. You want them snug, you don't want to leak, but you also don't want to strip out that hole. So just keep 6 to 10 foot-pounds in mind. As I'm tightening these screws down, I kind of like to test fit the carb to make sure the spigot is kind of facing straight. So as I tighten it down, right before I get down to the final tighten, I also like to slip the carb on there. I end up pulling it back off, but I like to slip the carb on there just to make sure everything's kind of setting in there right. Okay, now that the manifold's on, we're going to start putting our motor mounts back on, and we're going to start with this front one up here. This bracket goes on here, and we're going to get everything finger tight first. Make sure the hardware that goes to the front of the head has a washer and a lock washer. The two bolts going up into the frame just have a washer. And we're going to tighten the bolts to the head first, and we're going to tighten those down to 25 to 30 foot-pounds, and the ones going up into the frame, we're going to torque to 30 to 35 foot-pounds. A little bit of blue Loctite, just a dab, probably going to be okay too. So unless you have like a specialized attachment for your torque wrench, you may not have the ability to torque the stud coming out of this side of the head. That is okay. Just know the torque spec is 25 to 30 foot-pounds. Keep that in mind when tightening it up by hand. Don't go crazy because this is an aluminum head. Last thing you want to do is break this right here. You do have a lock washer on there. Throw a little bit of Loctite on it, probably going to be good. Just don't get crazy when you tighten this. So now we're gonna do the top motor mount. These are all these Allens. There'll be a 5/16 Allen that goes in here. You need this little plate that goes behind the top one, and then the other ones drop down to the heads. There are no lock washers on these. Blue Loctite, let's just say it's optional. After we get them finger tight, we're going to torque the ones going down into the heads anywhere from 25 to 30 foot-pounds, and then the top ones up here on the frame will be 30 to 35 foot-pounds. Okay, from here, your conversion from 883 to 1200 is done. And depending on what kind of accessories you have on your bike, your button up is gonna be different, but let's cover some of the basics. We do have a CV carb on this. You may have a different one, but so we know it just plugs in, and your air cleaner and exhaust is probably gonna be different than what we have. But as far as jetting, if you have a CV carb, the stock jetting on a CV carb actually is different on a lot of year ranges. This is an 01, and so the stock jetting is a 170 main and a 42 slow jet, and that's a good starting point. But the best thing to do is to find out what the stock jetting was for your year of 1200, because it does vary just a little bit, and start there. And from there, it's going to be reading your plugs. If they're too light, it's too lean. If your fouling plugs is too rich, and finding your happy medium there. And a lot of things go into reading those. If you have like a velocity stack or some wacky super short pipes, you're probably not going to be able to get the thing to run as perfectly as if you have pipes with a nice baffle and a nice intake. But that's a good start for jetting. Now don't forget to put oil back in your bike, and let's talk a little bit about break-in. Personally, there is something that I like to do, but there's a wide range of theory on break-in. What I like to do is put oil in the bike and heat cycle the bike twice, meaning I'll start the bike, bring it up till it's warm to the touch, you know, nice and not too hot, but hot, and then let it cool down. I'll heat cycle it again, let it cool down, and then change the oil. From there, go ride it for 500 miles. Again, there is different schools of thought on this. Some people break them in, they just go wham right to wide open. I like to ride mine for 500 miles in varying RPM ranges. And basically what you're just trying to do is get all the new parts to mesh together and seat your rings, as they like to say. So I like to go out, cruise for a little bit, run high RPM, run low RPM, not too high of RPM by the way, but just give it a nice range. After 500 miles, change your oil and filter again, and you should be good to go. Another thing is, from here, if you have a little bit of a taste for horsepower now that you've bumped up to the bigger displacement, you may be interested in a cam, and we have videos on that as well. I will say with cam selection, don't overcam your motor. Get a nice rideable cam, and also with stock heads, you can only go up to about a 490 lift cam anyway. Like I said, we'll put some links in there to the cam video. If you decide you want to do cams, again, that'll affect your jetting. But hey, this is a great start to a good running street motor. Have any questions? As always, drop us a comment and go work on those motorcycles.